The following is a Cartoonerific Studios presentation.
Welcome to Cartoon Fun, it's Cartoonerific. Yeah!
It's Cartoonerific. Cartoonerific. It's Cartoonerific. With your host Brian Mitchell.
Well, welcome to the Cartoonerific podcast, classic animated cartoons. I am Brian Mitchell, and I am your host. You know, as I was growing up and I was loving cartoons and animated cartoons, and I wanted to get into the industry as an animator, once I hit middle school and high school, I would occasionally get a comment from people, and people knew what I wanted to do. It was no secret. It was out there that this is what I want to do. I want to be a cartoonist. I was doing cartoon work in school and stuff. But I would hear from a teenager, a girl, or some guy, and they say, "You like cartoons? You still like cartoons?" And, you know, that's kid stuff. You know, I get those comments. And I even heard it from an art teacher. It would really bug me, but, you know, in some ways I understand, or I understood, because there were a lot of cartoons that were made for kids. I mean, Sesame Street had cartoons all over it. Saturday Morning was all for kids. And a lot of cartoons from the golden age of animation were dumped onto TV, and they were put on Saturday mornings or Monday through Friday mornings in the afternoon, you know, when kids got home from school, a lot of it. And there was a lot of stuff that wasn't very good, you know, and or stuff that was dumbed down for kids. Of course, there was the Looney Tunes and eventually the Tom and Jerry's and the Tex Avery cartoons, which are very clever and fun, and definitely too violent for kids, but they were shown in the morning or in the early afternoon, along with the Bugs Bunnies and the Roadrunners and stuff like that. And, you know, those cartoons were definitely not aimed for little kids, but little kids like me watched them and enjoyed them, and appreciated them even more as I got older. So the stigma was definitely there. And it bothered me. It really bothered me because people would even say that about Disney films. And Walt Disney was smart enough to aim these films at a certain level where the parents could enjoy them along with the kids. And they didn't talk down to you. They just, it was a good story, great animation, and you could watch that film over and over again and get something out of it. And so really wonderful films. But like I said, there were films that dumbed things down and short cartoons. I vowed that once I got into the animation profession, I would work on things that aimed higher, and so that, you know, everybody could enjoy the cartoon. So one of the first things I worked on was the Mighty Mouse series for Ralph Bakshi. And that was a show that definitely was clever, and it was very, very well written, definitely aimed higher, but kids could watch it and enjoy it. It tended to focus on projects that were aimed a little higher. So Tiny Toons and Animaniacs and other films after that, I would tend to do that. I think when Beauty and the Beast came out, when Disney produced that thing, and it came out and it was nominated for Best Picture Oscar, I'd have to say that was a pinnacle. It was basically saying that, yeah, this film can hold its own against any live action movie. And so that was a great, great thing. But occasionally we hear stuff, and it's unfortunate, but at the Oscars, and don't get me wrong, I love Jimmy Kimmel. I think he's very, very funny. And I think everybody is kind of fair game. But at the introduction to the animation categories, best short subject and best animated feature, there was a joke, and the joke was basically asking if the audience let their kids fill out the ballots for the animation Oscar. I cringed at that because I was like, oh God, here we go. It's taking us back to a time where this was a stigma. Well, there's still a little bit of a stigma apparently. And, some people chuckled at it, but there was a lot of backlash. So, we have to be able to laugh at ourselves. And I was not one of the people who laughed at that comment, of course, but I understand that we still have a lot of work to do. The thing is that animation has come out of this place where it was considered just for kids. Now it's much more appreciated by many, many, many more people. And so that's a very good thing. Well, the guest we have on today is a champion of animated cartoons, and he's talked about them, he's celebrated them, he does a lot of different things, including writing books. So he's so important to this medium because you need people like this that say, hey, look at this. Look how wonderful this is. That's what he's been doing for the last 40 years. He's worked in and out of animation. He's actually produced animation projects. He's worked for some of the biggest companies, Nickelodeon and Disney. He's basically been one of those people that is trying to get people's minds out of that these things are just for kids, trying to educate people onto the wonders and the artistry of animation. His name is Jerry Beck, known him for a long time, and he's coming up next on the Cartoonerific podcast. Don't go away.
The Cartoonerific podcast is now available on Spotify, Google, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Alexa, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, Player FM, Apple Podcasts, and many, many others. If you like what you hear, please subscribe. A new Cartoonerific podcast is uploaded every Friday. And now it's time for our special Cartoonerific guest.
Well, today I'm very excited that we have this guest on. I've known him for a long, long time. He's been involved with so many things. So he's written over 15 books on animation. Jerry was the research associate on the Of Mice and Magic book, which came out, I think, in the late 70s. But he's been a studio executive with Nickelodeon Movies and Disney. He's written for Hollywood Reporter and Variety, and he's curated cartoons for Blu-ray and DVD. Jerry is the editor of a couple of animation sites. One is called Cartoon Scoop. The other one is Cartoon Research. He has his hands involved with so many things. He's vice president of ASIFA Hollywood. He is one of the most important people in animation as he's taught about the history of it. I'm so glad that we have him here today. So please welcome Mr. Jerry Beck. Hi, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Well, that's great. Fine. It's like we didn't talk before this or something, Jerry, you were so important to the animation field, and I've told other people this, how important all the research that you've done, the history of it. Tell me, I know you had a love of cartoons when you were growing up, obviously. How did this all begin? How did this obsession with cartoons begin?
Well, I give you permission to stop me at some point, and I'll try to keep it concise.
Do your best. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, like every kid, I grew up watching, the Flintstones and Bugs Bunny cartoons and Casper and all that stuff when I came home from school. Mm-hmm. And at some point in my young years, I wanted to be a cartoonist. And I think my parents pointed me towards the funny pages, in the daily newspaper. And in fact, you probably may have grown up with the paper I grew up with, which was the Long Island Press. You remember that?
I do remember the Long Island Press. Yeah.
I haven't seen that in years.
Yeah. I think we're kind of a Newsday family.
You were Newsday. Yeah, we were. We
Yeah.
were a Long Island Press family. And
Where'd you grow up anyway? You grew up.
I grew up in Queens. I grew up in Flushing. I grew up in Kew Garden Hills near the World's Fair.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
area, Jewel Avenue and Main Street. Where were you?
Born in Brooklyn, like Bay Ridge area, and then moved out to Long Island when I was 8. And so the West Hempstead area. So close to Rockville Center area.
Yeah, we lived at the end of the subway lines, you know, wherever that was, you know, Flushing one, the Forest Hills one, that kind of thing. But anyway, I used to, you know, the only guidance I may have ever gotten from my mother was, you know, copy Peanuts or copy the comic strips, and that's what I would start doing. And I was interested in drawing, and I loved comic books and all that. And at some point in my high school years, when I was trying to figure out what am I going to do with my life after high school, I didn't give it much thought, except that I loved to draw, and I drew through high school. And I would go home and watch the cartoons, and I remember thinking, how do they do that? How do they make a drawing move? I remember my original thinking about how impossible it seemed, and to give it character. I remember the scene of Elmer Fudd from one of the earliest ones. I'm sure it's Robert McKimson animation, where it was how do you do that? I could never understand that, but I was fascinated by it. I wanted to be a comic book person. At some point, I decided that animation might make some sense because you know, it was a combination of movies. I love movies and drawing, and animation was right in the middle. And after high school, I did attend the School of Visual Arts for about a year and a half, 2 years, and some interesting people, teachers there, which I'm still friends with some of the students I met there, and some of the teachers. Some of those students were like my good friend Tom Cito, for example, who I just saw yesterday.
Oh wow!
So you know, I met him there at the School of Visual Arts. I also, you know, at that exact time, I was very heavily into all movies of all sorts, and knew who Leonard Maltin was. You know, at that time, you know, in New York, like Leonard Maltin was not famous. He was just a guy. He had written the great movie shorts and the movie comedy teams books. But I loved those books. I kept thinking, I'd love to see a book like this, like for animation. Wouldn't that be great? All my questions could be answered. All the cartoons could be listed. And Leonard, to my great shock, had just come out. Well, no, this wasn't the shock part. One day I was coming home around that exact time, in I guess 74 or so, and waiting for the bus in Forest Hills to take me home. There was a bookstore, and in the window was a brand new book called The Disney Films by Leonard Maltin, the author of the great movie shorts. I remember it says that on the cover, and I'm like, wow, I have to look at this book. And I went inside, and I could not put that book down. And I think I had the $12 it cost to buy it in my pocket, which, you know, everybody had cash back then, but $12 was like saying $35 today. You know, it was like, but I said, I can't leave without reading this book. I have to finish the rest of this book. And I bought it, took it home. I remember reading, it's one of those classic cases, cover to cover that night. I had to.
Yeah.
I remember my favorite thing was I went into the bookstore and I kept thinking to myself, oh, so it's a list of all the animated features, huh? And I thought I was so smart. I was like, let's see if he's got the Reluctant Dragon. And so oh my God, there's a whole chapter on the Reluctant Dragon.
Yeah.
Let's see if he's got anything on Victory Through Air Power. Holy shit, he's got a whole thing on Victory Through Air Power.
Right.
So I said, this was an absolute must-have. And I was like, this guy, I love his stuff. And then I found out, this was the shock thing. I found out to my shock that he had a class at the new school teaching about animation history. Wow. And it was a real class. Now just to stop for a second, Brian, did you ever come to those classes later at the new school?
I did. I think you invited me down to one or two when I went, and they were fun. They were fun. Yeah. I just want to stop you. Disney Films is a great book, and he updated it over the years. And isn't it still in print? It's still in print, right?
I believe it's still in print.
Yeah.
I think the second edition, not to boast, I think I get a research associate credit on one of the editions. I think it's the second or third one, because at one point he really added he added a lot more films, that were made like after Disney died and things like that.
Right.
So we were into that. But this class that I found out about, it was like nobody knew about it. It was like a real college course.
Yes.
It was not what you had seen. It was not open to the public. It was not 5 or 6 classes. It was like 15 classes, and it was the real deal. And it was for credit, and but somehow I found out what you had to do to enroll in this class, and I remembered it was like, I think in my mind's eye, it was like $150 or $200. It was, and again, you got to remember that with inflation, that's like $500. And for somebody who's, just out of high school, and I'm figuring out how to live on my own and all kinds of things, the money was astronomical. But you know what? I had to meet this guy, and he was talking about what I was really interested in. And I said, I got to meet this guy.
Sure.
So I took this class. It was like, I'm going to say that, to be generous, I'll say there were 10 students in it. And when the class was over, the first one, I brought my 2 copies of the great movie shorts and the Disney films with me. Figured I'd get them autographed.
Sure.
And I when the class was over, all the students fled out the door except me. And I walked over to him. I said, I really want to meet you, and I love your books. I had them here. I'd like to get them autographed. And we became instant friends immediately from that moment on. And I love the fact that he dated one of his autographs in the book, so I know the exact day I met him.
Right. Wow.
I'd have to look that up. But anyway, we ended up, the class was not doing well because it only had 10 students. So the next year, the school or somebody came up with the idea of doing it the way you saw it, which was a more limited class in that arena-like classroom, where it was like shown like a movie theater. And that did very, very, very well.
Right.
And I was like his assistant in that class for years. This is like the mid-70s. And I remember asking him at that point, why aren't you doing a book like the great movie shorts for animation? And he had a lot of reasons why he didn't. He loved animation, but one main reason that stuck with me was that was around the time when Funny World was coming out. Remember that?
Mike Barrier.
Right.
Yeah.
Give a cough there. So Mike Barry had mentioned in the early 70s in Funny World that he was writing a book, which we now know came out with 25 years later.
That's right.
Hollywood cartoons. Right. But he mentioned it then that this was all he was doing his stuff. So Leonard was like, basically, Barrier's going to do it. It's going to be great. I think he's doing so much research. No reason for me to even begin. That was his thinking. So about a year or 2 later, when Barrier's books, we all thought Barrier's book was coming out momentarily. That was like the thinking everybody had at the time then. About 2 years later or so, and doing the class after a long time, Leonard basically one day came to me and said, there is no reason why I can't do a book, on this. And, I think, if Barry's book comes out before it or after it, all right. But I think I can do something. I feel like I have a point of view on how to write it. And it was around that time, maybe earlier than that even, that I was so fanatic to know, you got to understand. I've told this story before, so sorry for everybody out there who may have heard it before.
No, I'm sure people want to hear it again if they've,
somewhere in that period. And I would watch, we people like us, we didn't grow up. And so we watched Saturday morning all the time.
Sure.
And we watched Bugs Bunny on Saturday morning. And I remember one morning, I'm going to say it was around 74, maybe 75. I got up on Saturday morning and it was the middle of a cartoon. I'll now identify it for those who know out there. It was the cartoon called It's Hummer Time. It's a Robert McKimson cartoon with Not Happy Birthday. That one.
Right.
Anyway. It has those gags in it. And I turned it on. It was the middle of that cartoon. I'm watching it, and I said to myself, "Oh, I love this cartoon. I love these gags. This is great. What's the name of this cartoon?" And you know what? There was nowhere to find that information out. There was no books.
Right.
There was no list. Even if you had the list, it would have the title. There was no way to figure out what cartoon this was. There was no internet, of course. No Wikipedia. All those things you guys have today.
Right.
But I immediately thought, well, the only way the next cartoon came on and had whatever title it was, and I'm like, the only way to know what the title of that cartoon that just passed is to watch this show every week, and eventually they're going to rerun it, which I knew at the time. I knew they were going to rerun it again, and they did. And to write down the title for each one, and I'll catch it, and I'll know the name of it, so that way I can refer to it to people.
Right.
And and I did that. And then it just hit me. It's like there was no list. There was no reference. There was nothing for the Warner cartoons. I had to do it. I had to get into it. I asked Leonard, who I now knew, I said, "How did you do the Little Rascals in your movie shorts book? How did you do the Three Stooges? How did you have a plot synopsis and who was in it for each one?" And I go, "I'd like to do that with cartoons." And he's like, what I did was, and he told me, and it was the Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library in New York. I don't know if you know it.
Right.
The library is still there. And it's the equivalent to what we have out here in LA. They have the Margaret Herrick Library, which might be better. But that's part of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science. Open to the public library. Anybody can. And back in those days, and still to this day, both these libraries, they had bound volumes of everything, all the trade magazines, house organs, all sorts of stuff.
Wow.
And Leonard said to go to those. They have, Motion Picture Herald has released charts, and then we ended up doing. I was part of a group in New York that had collected 16 millimeter film because we didn't have videotape yet.
Right.
In the mid-70s.
I did that too.
All my friends were collecting 16 millimeter. I had a lot of friends who had a hell of a lot of cartoons.
Yeah.
And so I would start. Will Friedwald, who I met not at Leonard's class, but there was another guy teaching another animation course. And I met Will Friedwald. He was like 13 years old, but he was like, I was talking to him about it, and I said, "I really want to do this too. I want to help. He's like my Robin to my being Batman, so to speak.
Right.
So and I was kind of Robin to Leonard Martin being Batman. So I said, "Well, you can come meet me. I happen to have a job. I happened to have a job in the mid 70s. I don't remember how many years I was doing this, but I had a job that I worked. At one point, I worked midnight to 7. And then another time I worked, it was down on Wall Street, like for Goldman Sachs and Dun & I worked in the computer rooms, but in the night shifts.
Right.
And at one point I worked from 6 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. That was very convenient for what I was doing, because at 1 in the afternoon, I'd take the subway from Wall Street up to Lincoln Center. And I would spend all day at Lincoln Center going through the trade magazines and writing down by hand. And I still have copies. I still have my handwritten things.
Wow.
I had every single cartoon title, all the release dates. Meanwhile, then at night, there was one night that the library was open late, but if it wasn't open late, we would run uptown to one friend or another friend, and we'd watch as many old cartoons as we could. And we take notes, all kinds of notes, plot synopses. We take down to our credits, and we started amassing all of this information on all the classic Hollywood cartoons. You got to remember, back in those days, an epiphany I had. You'll appreciate this.
Sure.
When I went to School of Visual Arts, and I was learning how to animate, although I dropped out of that, but I was learning it. And I had Gil Moret and
he was my instructor, by the way. Marty Abrams.
Gil Moret, guy. And Marty Abrams, who's still with us, and I communicate with him still. I think he's moved out here to LA now.
Wow.
But he was my other teacher. And they would bring in films, 16 millimeter films to show the class on occasion. I still remember Gil Moret bringing in My Daddy the Astronaut.
Right,
And,
right.
And I remember my jaw dropping to myself in my brain going, they were still making Paramount cartoons in the 60s, and here's one. I've never seen these. And boy, that really opened up a door. And then Marty Abrams brought in what turned out to be a Technicolor print of Dumbo. And I only know this because he allowed me to borrow it. That's how people were back then.
Sure.
I said, I was starting my 16 millimeter collecting. I said, could I watch this at home as well? So he let me borrow this beautiful 16 millimeter Technicolor print of Dumbo.
Wow.
And I realized at that moment, this is, let's say 74, 75. I remember thinking, I really don't care about animation now. And I still to this day say that the mid 70s was the nadir, if that's the right word, the worst period of animation, in my opinion, in the history of animation. It's the weakest period. No, I mean, there's good things to be found.
Sure.
And I was part of the SIFA East at that time. So we had a festival and we saw some great things. And I met people like Bruno Bizzetto and Osamu Tezuka came into town. But anyway, that was all that was going on in the 70s. And but I remember thinking to myself that, you know what I care about? I care little about making new animation, but I really care about old animation. I care about what was.
Right.
And that's one of those things that bit me, as I need to research this because it needs to be out there. Also, this was a period, the 70s. I now teach in my class that starting in the late 50s through the 90s, through the beginning of the 90s, or the late 80s, animation was considered kids stuff. I'm sure you remember this, Brian.
Oh yeah.
That it was perceived as a children's medium in this country, and it wasn't that way. I would say prior to television animation, Hanna-Barbera, late 50s, but it wasn't thought of that way. But from that point, from that Yogi Bear period up, that's why the Flintstones was so miraculous. It was like suddenly something happened in the brain of society that animation was suddenly for kids. And but it continued that way, and it was, like I say, even worse by the 70s.
Yeah.
So I had a bifurcated or a twofold mission in life, which was to research these great classic cartoons and have the information available that they exist. And number two, try to convince people that this isn't a children's medium. Now, we've gotten better, obviously in the last 20 to 30 years, in terms of the perception. But still, I still hear the bias. I still, we're coming out of that shell. That's why some of the things I've done, not to get us off this at the moment, but some of the things I've done, the books that I've done, when I was distributing anime for a while, everything I've done is in service of trying to convince people that animation isn't just a kid's medium. Yeah, that's really, I want to look behind. What am I doing? That's sort of my mission.
Well, that's why we kind of discovered Don Bluth at the same time, because it seemed like he was trying to do things that were elevating the medium. And
Absolutely.
I just want to tell you a brief story. I was working there in the late 80s, early 90s as an animator. And we were working on a film called Troll in Central Park. And I got really upset at a screening because I felt like I was watching a film for 3-year-olds. And I was very vocal about it at the studio. And I was called in because they heard I was not happy with it. And so I went in and I told them, I said, you're going to kill this studio because you're going against everything that I perceive. Animation is not for little kids, It can be for everybody though. And I just felt like the mission that they started out, which was to make animation better, right? I think that's what Don Bluth's thing was. Yep. To this point, I felt, which was the lowest point with the Don Bluth studio. I just told him, I said, you're going to kill your own studio. I remember saying that, and they weren't happy about it. But I explained what I felt, and they didn't fire me. I thought they were going to fire me, honestly. But that
Were
anyway,
you in
that's
Ireland?
yeah. What was that?
You were in Ireland?
I was in Burbank. We were working on it in
Burbank.
Burbank by the airport. And so, yeah.
Well, first of all, I applaud you, and I'm glad they didn't fire you. I'm sure they did.
I quit.
I mean,
I quit
we should
later.
have a panel one day. We should have a panel one day and debate. Don Bluth's most, and I love Don. I still communicate with Gary and John. I did a panel at CTN with them recently.
Right.
We're still friends, but I've never really openly criticized them. Maybe you guys will hear this, but you guys, everybody knows. We all know that these films, it is disturbing. I mean, they start off. Even the idea of doing The Secret of Nim, and then going into the Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, where they know those weren't aimed at children because they were for video game players.
Right.
Those were all good choices. I mean, I was going to say we should have a panel debating, which film is the most aimed at children that they did, because I would probably pick Rockadoodle. Which might be their most incoherent film, but Thumbelina is pretty. I mean, the trick is you don't start there where you're aiming at children. You gotta aim high. The kids will join you, and the parents will like it too.
Yeah.
If you make it for little kids, then you lost the parents, and even the kids know it's for babies. That's the problem there.
That's the problem.
The artwork. The animation is fantastic in the Bluth films.
It is, but if you are ultimately, I don't think you're selling toward the kid at all. I think you're selling toward the parent. So if the parent looks at it and goes, "This looks stupid, we're not going," or "This looks really juvenile," because they got to sit through it. They got to sit through an hour and a half of it, right?
So, because the general consensus, the media, the public perception. It's just that cartoons are for kids. I mean, when the animators start thinking that way, you're lost. You ain't succeed. You got to make the films you want to see. It's happening now, obviously. I mean, there's more of it happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. What happened? Okay, look, you went.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you went to Leonard Maltin's class. You collaborated with him on Of Mice and Magic. How long did that take to get that book out? What was your function on that book? Because I consider that book very important. I mean, it basically covered every single studio.
I do too, and I want to clear up anybody who thinks I wrote it or anything like that. I was there. I was pretty much there for every page.
Right.
But when I started doing this with Will Friedwald, we started doing these master lists of cartoons. I remember Leonard knew I was doing it. I was showing him what I was doing. I was literally showing him my stuff, and I said that maybe I'm going to try to do a book that's just the book that we did ultimately with the Warner Brothers cartoons, where it was just a filmography and would explain what was in each cartoon and that kind of thing. Right.
Great book, by the way. And great resource.
Yeah. He basically, we were going to do that for every studio. That was our thinking. And he basically said to me that I'm thinking of doing a book, the way I see it for about the history of animation. And he basically formally said to me, "I'd like you to be my assistant on it, and I would like to use your research that your filmographies and things like that." Because when you have the filmography, it's something I learned then. Once you have the filmography, that's the roadmap. Again, with no filmography, you don't even know where to begin or end, or you know what I mean. It's unknown territory. But with the filmography, you could see, he stopped directing here, and you can see things at a glance.
Sure.
And so I immediately said, "Yeah, I mean, he's Leonard Maltin." He was, again, nobody in the real world, nobody knew who Leonard Maltin was, but I knew who he was from the other books he had done, and I was like, "Wow, I want to be involved with this." And we did a lot of interviews together. We did a lot of. We went to. I remember one day, amongst many other stories I could say, but I remember one day you remember Willoughby Peerless on 32nd Street?
Yeah.
And Leonard had access to. He knew people there.
Right.
And so they allowed us to go upstairs in that building to nobody sees. And they had something I had never seen then or since. They had every Terry Toon on a shelf in order. It was like they had them in chronologic release order somehow, because I think that's the production number order. And so we could there was a wall of Terry Toons, and we literally sat there with a projector, a Willoughby Peerless projector, and we could pick anything we wanted from the whole Terry to watch. And we were there for at least 2 or 3 days watching Terry Toons from this bank, which I think they ultimately sold all these films on their Washington Day, Washington's birthday sale, where they would sell films like this for $5.
I bought a bunch at Willoughby Peerless. They were in white boxes, and it's just a label on the side of what the cartoon was. And a lot of them were black and white, and there were color, and there were whole shows of Deputy Dog.
I still have this to this day. Why this would be, a lot of them that were black and white with the TV ones with the Gene Deitch openings, but a couple of them I bought at the time the one that was titled Farmer Alfalfa's Ape Girl, because the title sounded so cool, but it has the original titles, the actual, So I was like, wow. I mean, you didn't know it really was like a grab bag there. You didn't know what you were getting until you took it home and watched it. But was this like surplus from Terry Toons? Because Terry Toons was in New Rochelle. You know what? I think it was. I've never thought about it. You just brought up a good point. I actually think it was. That's the only explanation. I mean, the other explanation would be that some TV station, dumped them and sold them to Willoughby Peerless. But you know what? Because Terry Toons was in New York, it sort of makes a lot of sense that it was something that the studio itself got rid of. Yeah, that makes sense. I think so. I got a couple of Silly Sydneys from there in color. Oh, yeah. They're wonderful in color, aren't they? Not only color. I pretty much stopped collecting now, but I have a very good collection of the Gene Deitch era, Silly Sydney in particular, where not only they're in Technicolor and scope. Wow! And I got a scope lens to watch them, and they're pretty amazing. The Gene Deitch Terry Toons. My line about that is they out UPA'd UPA. In my opinion, they were better UPA cartoons than what UPA was making in 1958, 57. Well, they were very experimental for those couple of years. They were, and I got to become friends with Gene, and I heard all the stories. The artists loved what he was doing. Connie Rosinski, Jim Tyre, the management, Bill Weiss. Bill Weiss in particular hated Bill Weiss. I look from his point of view, I can see he wanted him to continue doing Echo and Jekyll and Mighty Mouse and cartoons with animals. Right. And he was doing this UPA thing that was from another planet. So he worked to get rid of Deitch, and he succeeded. Yeah. And then immediately, I don't know if you know, they took one or two of his cartoons. They took a Clint Clobber, I think, where they turned all the characters into animals. Now that Deitch is gone, I mean, so silly. That's funny. It's just sad because that was actually, they had some really cool titles. The title sequences on those were a lot of fun. Ralph Bakshi worked on those cartoons too. Oh, yeah. And he learned a lot by observing. I talked to him about it, but he was just an ink and paint at that time and beginning to do animation. And he was like seeing what Deitch was doing was a big influence on Bakshi, because Deitch, Bakshi, they were doing Mighty Mouse, they're doing Dinky Duck. Deitch comes in, they're doing contemporary little stories, things that made sense in 1956, right? In 57. And you can see that's where Bakshi gets it from. It's so funny. I've once said, back when John Kay was in favor, back before he kind of ruined his career. Sorry, John. Right. But I at one point during that period, I said, there's a line between John Hubley and John Kay. The line is, there was John Hubley, and he's amazing, and his story, and UPA and this and that, and then but Hubley hired Deitch because Hubley was into jazz. Deitch was the art editor of the Record Collector, doing these cool cool cat cartoons for that publication. He hired Deitch and trained him as Deitch told me, the first pure UPA animator, because everybody at UPA was from Disney, and Hubley had the idea that he wanted to take somebody who had none of that Disney training and train him to what we're doing now.
Right.
And so he trains Deitch. Deitch is an influence heavily on Bakshi because they're both the Terrytoons. And then, of course, Bakshi, John Kay was kind of his protege, to Bakshi. So there's literally a line between John Hubley to John Kay. I thought that was very interesting.
That's interesting. Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm not going to leave the interview, but you keep giving me questions, and I'll keep answering. I don't know if I answered your question about how I got into this, so feel free to.
Well, no, you did, and then you said you kind of got out of it.
As you know, Brian.
Yes.
I ended up with a day job during that period. The greatest thing that ever happened, one of many, but one of the greatest things that ever happened in my life was the day I got hired. A fluky circumstance. I'm not going to talk about that. I got hired at United Artists,
right?
And
that's where I met. That's where I met you at
right,
MGM.
That's where you met me.
I think it was before it became MGM UA, right? It was just UA Classics.
I started there in 1978 at the beginning of the year, and I was there until 1984. And yes, I was working for the Classics. I was working for the 16 millimeter department. And so I was able to deal with regular movies, old movies, the cartoons in 16 millimeter.
Right. I
was able to do, you may may have a copy of, see if I can find my copy of it here.
Sure.
Remember this, Brian? Did you ever see this? I'm showing something to Brian.
I do remember it. Yes.
It has Banjo the Woodpile Cat on it. This was a cartoon catalog that I put together while I worked for United Artists. I got Leslie Cabarga to do the cover. I got Leonard to write an introduction at the beginning, and I programmed all of the collections that were available for rent back in those days. That was one of the things I did there, amongst many things.
Right. I remember that. I have a copy of that somewhere.
I'm sure I would have given you one back in those days.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think they're collectibles. I don't really know. I think I have 3. So if anybody's got them out there, but I did. But during the day, I was working for United Artists and doing all kinds of movie stuff. And then at night, I would be working on research and animation stuff. And you were asking before, how long did of Mice and Magic? I always remember it was like. Let me see if I can remember this better, because there was 1 year from 79 through 80 where the book was finished in early 1979, and then it was edited and went to the printer and photos and a million things took a year. A year later, it came out from when it was sent. And so I always remember that. And I also remembered that it was at least 4 years. I thought it was 4 years. It might have been 3, but it was 3 or 4 years that we worked on that book. 3 or 4 years. It took forever to work on that.
It's such an important book. When I got it, I read it from cover to cover. And what's neat is the back, where basically every single cartoon that the studio produced for each studio, because it's basically. It has Fleischer in there. Is it divided from Fleischer to Famous? Does it have a separate section for Famous?
It goes up to UPA. In fact, I had a little footnote. I had worked at United Artists. I was working on Mice and Magic. I was compiling all these lists, and I was debating in my head. You got to remember, at that period, I was there. We really should put the Patty Freeling in here. And Leonard didn't want to go that far. They get a mention, but we didn't go that far. So and I was working for UA, where we had all the Patty Freeling stuff.
Yeah.
And I did it anyway. Pardon me. I did my own collection. And then years later, in the 2000s, I got the call one day from a publisher, said, "Would you like to do a book?" DK publisher, like tie-in book with the new Pink Panther Steve Martin movie, the Pink Panther book of some sort. I said, yeah. And my only condition was I wanted to use my filmography that I did for Mice and Magic. So it's in there. It's in. I feel like that was one of those moments where done. We have in that Pink Panther book DK put out in the back. They did not want to do it. They don't do stuff like that.
Right.
They don't do heavy research stuff. But I got them to let me put in every Patty Freeling cartoon. I think possibly they all have a plot synopsis and by the way,
they do. I have that book. I have that book. I think it's the Ultimate Pink Panther. Yeah,
it's the Ultimate Guide or something like that. But the thing is, of Mice and Magic, when we were doing when we were getting ready to do it and all of that, we tried to put, like Leonard did in his great movie shorts, a one-line plot synopsis for every cartoon. I wanted to have exactly what he had for the Three Stooges. I wanted to have that in of Mice and Magic.
Sure.
And for a variety of reasons, I'm sure it was the editors, but Leonard also said to me, we can't do it. We can't do it in the end because it was going to add another 100 pages or so. It was going to add a lot of pages to it.
Right.
And it was and you got to understand, a lot of these companies, the publishers, they don't see any value in these filmographies. It's so weird. If it were up to them, they would not have them.
Right.
So there's always a fight for these things. So it's because the Mice and Magic filmographies in the back only have the title, the director, and maybe the series title and the release date.
Right.
And that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
And because it only has that, it doesn't have any more, which I wanted.
Right.
That's what caused me and Will Friedwald to immediately, at least we said, let's do one on Warner Cartoons because everybody wants that. I want it.
Mm-hmm.
We did that. We did a Warner Brothers version of what I would have hoped we could have done.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the beginning. That was also a stepping stone towards the other things that I did in this regard because luckily that came out in 1981.
Right.
I have my beat up copy of it here.
And the Warner Brothers cartoons. Yeah. It's is it still in release? Let me just stop for a second. Is that still in release, or is that
in print?
Yeah.
I believe you can go to Scarecrow Press and it's still in print.
Wow.
And we did a second preface in a later edition where I mention, because there was a lot of boo-boos in that book, but there were two big boo-boos in that book, in my opinion. So I did this 2-page, welcome to the second edition. And I mentioned all the things that are wrong, or not all of them, but as many as I could,
sure,
just so anybody reading this would know that we're aware of that problem. We're aware of it.
Right.
But that's why I fought for 5 years to do this book, which is called Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies.
Yes.
I don't know. You've seen.
Oh, yeah.
And this was the revenge book, I call it, meaning this time Scarecrow Press wouldn't print any photos or pictures or anything
mm-hmm.
in the original version. So I said, let's completely redo it, rewrite it completely, and get photos. And it took forever to get permissions, but we did it all legally through Warner Brothers. We got them to do the cover for us.
Mm-hmm.
And it was completely rewritten. And actually, it's a better book because we had done that earlier one. We were able to use the earlier one as kind of the rough draft, of which publicly people could tell us what was wrong, what was missing,
mm-hmm.
and that kind of thing. This is a better book. That said, oh boy, do I've got stories. This is a whole other broadcast because there's stories about how this book came to be. And the publishers didn't want to do this either. But luckily, we had Warner Brothers, including Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, Friz Freeling, still alive, all on our side with the Warner Brothers studio itself.
Right.
We're we want them to do this. They helped get that book published.
Wow, that's very neat. Very neat.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you just a quick question, because out of all the classic cartoons, we're just going to do this on just on the side here, right? Out of all the cartoon studios, if you had to rate them, okay, and don't get me wrong, I love them all. I love Terrytoons. I love famous studio stuff. But for me, the number one cartoon studio, and it's kind of a weird number one because it's a number one A and number one B would be probably Warner Brothers and Disney. And Disney for different reasons. For cartoons like Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom and Ben and Me and The Little House and Cowboy Needs a Horse and all that stuff. And then the Warner Brothers cartoons just for the diversity, the type of, the one-shots and the Roadrunners and the Bugs and Daffy and I love all the directors did great work. There's
Brian, we are on the same page, but I'll elucidate when you allow me.
Well, I'm allowing you right now, but you know where I'm going. Yeah.
So give me your question again. Let's make it pure. What's your question?
Okay.
Your question is
top three studios. Top three studios, absolute favorites, but you can temper that. You can say, well, like
you, I could say something nice about every one of them, and I could criticize every one of them, perhaps. But when you first asked it before you told me your choices, I was going to say, well, Disney and Warner's are the top.
Yeah.
And it's hard to argue with that. I mean, there's all kinds of. See, here's the thing, as you know, there's all kinds of issues with that. First of all, is one talking about quality of animation? Is one talk about overall, I guess? But there's different periods. If you talk about something like MGM, the 30s with harmonizing is a whole other ballgame from the 40s.
Yeah.
And so it's like when do you start sectioning? I will say this, and I have said this many times. The worst is any with some rare exceptions, any of the Walter Lantz cartoons from 1960, 61 until they stopped in 1972.
Right.
There's one or two that I actually kind of like in the 60s, but those aren't directed by Paul Smith, who was probably the worst director ever, in my opinion.
Right.
So that I think we can all agree on that.
Right.
Disney and Warner's were doing different things. The great thing about my teaching in the last 10 years is I get to talk about this stuff over and over and over again. And I'm sure if I talk to other professors and teachers, they'd say the same thing. I keep coming up with new theories and thoughts about it, and even doing more research on it all. And it's really been a great thing for me to do. And so I've learned and evolved in thinking about how these studios did. Also, I have the unique perspective, as you know, from having worked for a film distributor. I worked for United Artists. I worked for Orion Pictures. I had my own company called Streamline Pictures.
Right.
I've worked as a development executive. I've worked in production. I've done everything you could think of except actually animate.
Right.
But I've been involved, so I have this broad perspective on what happened and how it happened. A lot of people are like, "Oh, I didn't like the Disneys because they're boring compared to the Warner cartoons." Yeah, sure they are, but that was then. But if you really look at the Disney cartoons from Steamboat Willie up through, I was going to say Brave Little Tailor, but you can go further than that.
Little Whirlwind,
Yeah. I love the Little Whirlwind.
Yeah.
The evolution, the progression of what's going on at Disney is jaw-dropping, and it's a different ballgame from what Warner's was doing. They were all doing different things, and Disney's the more important studio, of course. They were. Everybody followed Disney. Disney was the leader. Disney was the household name.
Disney trained everybody.
Disney trained everybody.
Yeah.
Warner's, they were all doing that. Every other studio, including even Warner's, through the late 30s. It was because they wouldn't budge with their budgets at Warner's, and that's why harmonizing left. Warner people had to figure out another way, another path, and that path was not following Disney. That path was what Tex Avery and Frank Tashlin, in particular, brought to the studio, which was to do funny cartoons. I just love what they did. It took like 3 or 4 years leading to 1940, leading to Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny was the turning point, the game-changing moment, where they really realized, and all the other studios that were trying futilely to copy Disney realized we can't do that, but we all can do what Warner's is doing. And now that Warner's has a success, a big success with Bugs Bunny, that's why suddenly in 1940, suddenly all these characters from Tom and Jerry, Woody Woodpecker, 41 is Fox and Crow, or Heckle and Jekyll's the next year or whatever. I may have the chronology wrong. No, Heckle and Jekyll was like 45, but everybody, Famous Studios was adding characters like the Hungry Goat and Blackie the Sheep, and suddenly this new, Warner Brothers sense of humor was entering. It was went by trends. So it's so interesting and convenient that those trends were in 10-year periods that are right on the mark. So you got Mickey Mouse at the beginning, and then you got Popeye, okay, and then you got Bugs Bunny in 1940, and then you got Mr. Magoo and UPA in the 50s. I have a theory about, I'm going off subject here again, but I have a theory about the Patty Freeling and the Pink Panther, because by then television was persuasive. That's not the right word. I'm not saying it right, but it was ingrained now. TV animation and Hanna-Barbera were the kings of that, and so their style really pervaded, if that's the word, what was going on in animation. But the Patty Freeling, my God, look at the first 2 or 3 years when they're just doing the Pink Panther and then the Inspector. Yeah. Just that.
Great shorts.
Maybe even the
great shorts.
Right. Even 1 or 2 of the early Roland and Ratfink cartoons. Holy shit! They're actually coming up with a new look here that isn't UPA and it isn't Warner's, and it's cool. And they were cool in movie theaters. I remember, because I'm old enough, I remember seeing the Patty Freeling cartoons in theaters, and audiences watched them. They laughed at them. People thought they were great, and they won Oscars. And so, but the thing is, nobody followed them, meaning nobody copied what they were doing, like people did in the 50s with UPA, like people did in the 40s with Bugs Bunny, Mickey Mouse and Disney in the 30s. The Patty Freeling cartoons just sort of were, but it was Hanna-Barbera that was the big influence of the 60s. Sure. And then I can go on and on, but Disney dies, and that's why the 70s to me is the big black hole of animation.
Do you have any questions or comments about the podcast? Please email Brian at Cartoonerific.com. Your email may be featured in one of our future shows.
Hey, that was Jerry Beck. And Jerry will be back next week for part 2 of our interview, so please come back for that. Hey, if you're a big Fern Gully The Last Rainforest fan, have I got a treat for you. We were made aware of this by Mr. Zachary Zumwalt. It is a collection of original artwork from the Fern Gully movie, from the production of Fern Gully, and it is on Instagram. And if you want to check that out, it is the symbol at the Fern Gully Collection. And just go to Instagram and put that in, and it should pop up. All sorts of wonderful art on there for you to take a look at. And thank you, Zachary, for letting us know about that. If you really like what you're listening to, please subscribe. Hit the little dingy there on the site that you get the podcast from to subscribe. And if you really like what you're listening to, please tell a friend. Anyway, we have more fun stuff coming up next week and the week after and the week after that. So once again, I hope you have a great day. Hope you have an excellent week, and we'll see you all again next time.
This has been a Cartoonerific Studios presentation.
The Cartoonerific podcast is copyright 2024 by Cartoonerific Studios Incorporated. All rights reserved.